Over the last 1 month plus, public space has been awash with what the DA is about. Initially, there were conversations inconclusive as to what I had tabled before Parliament as electoral and constitutional reforms. And today, I have invited you to share a compressed version of these issues, such that nobody misconstrues our intentions. Initially, I want to state that, like I said at my last briefing to the nation, that we had written to majority political actors, platforms, informing them of our intention to interact. A few have not yet received these letters because offices are closed for the festive season. And beginning today, we have embarked on transmitting this communication. And we hope we'll be able to interact with these different political platforms, including civic or citizen platforms, informal civil society organizations, to discuss the contents of our intentions at the DA. We have received a nod of positivity informally from some of them. We are going to formalize these interactions, and we shall be informing you as the fourth estate so that we can share the sentiments and the views of the different actors with the rest of the nation. Now, the most important issue is what is the DA's national transition and reform proposal about? Because I have seen media commentators not necessarily misrepresenting, but probably misconstruing what this was. You know, these are new concepts to majority of the generation here and in most media houses. So you hear commentary totally different from what we are talking about here. And I blame no one, because issues of reforms, transitions are alien issues to our space. We are used to processes where the outgoing is the incoming, and therefore you have no conversation about the possibility of a reform or a transition. And how can I blame a media practitioner who is 30 years or 40 years, who has never seen a transition, who has never seen a change? So these are alien concepts, and I am here to share with you a simplified, a condensed version of these issues that you can inform the country as to what exactly we're trying to do, and re-energize and rekindle the spirit of this nation before it collapses on our backs. And our proposal at the DA is aimed at forming a basis for a national conversation, national discussion, and debate and dialogue on the future of Uganda. And note, these are our objectives. Other people can add theirs, but these are our objectives. They are essentially 6 in propagating the idea of a national transition and reform processes. The reform processes we have talked about variously. It involves reforming a number of laws, including amending the national constitution. But to break down the principal 6 objectives: 1, to ensure key constitutional, electoral, and administrative reforms that should be effected before the next general election. Our intention is to make sure that before the next general election, potentially in January next year, we undertake critical legal or critical constitutional and political reforms before we are enthusiastic about participating in the next election. And I'll expound more on what that is about. 2, to ensure the conduct of non-violent, free, fair, credible, verifiable, and consequential elections. Some electoral processes are actually being inconsequential. I'll give you an example. For the bulk of the last elections in which I've been active, 4 of them, probably 6 of them, the only consequential outcome has only been limited to local governments and parliament. The presidency has been insulated from any consequence. That's why the media will say the incoming is the outgoing is actually the incoming. So there's no conversation as to the possibility. Say, what if the incoming collapses in an election? What happens? What if the incumbent is thoroughly defeated without an iota of doubt and he hangs on? What happens? So we want a conversation because we want to have an idea of what looks like a free, fair, credible, and verifiable election. You remember, in the last 3 elections, Dr. Kizza Besigye was consistent in saying, if you think I lost, can we go ahead and verify and authenticate the nature of my loss? Can we go ahead and authenticate the nature of my opponent's victory? That has never happened. So we are saying, before we go into the next election, there must be a framework capable of providing verification for the consequences or the outcomes of an election. 3, to buttress mechanisms that guarantee peaceful and smooth transfer of power from one leader to another. Apparently, there's no such mechanism because we do not have a Presidential Transition Act. We don't have a mechanism that guarantees what happens to those who leave power. People hang on to power sometimes because they fear that there's no framework to insulate them from the crimes they have committed while in power. We want to have an arrangement of guarantees, an arrangement of ensuring that those who leave power actually don't leave the country. So if they have committed crimes against the citizens, there must be a framework of understanding the nature of crimes. Are they crimes in personam? Are they state crimes? So where's the framework? 4, to campaign for the implementation of a national reconciliation and reparation plan. Gentlemen and ladies, so much has been going on over the last 40 years under the leadership of General Museveni and his people. We surely know that there are so many injured citizens. There are so many affected citizens. And somehow, the political actors believe that they can be ignored. We don't think so. A nation that ignores the injured is a nation of fools. I don't think we are. We cannot afford the luxury of ignoring citizens that have been injured over time. So what will happen to citizens whose children have disappeared under the auspices of General Museveni and his people? Should we simply say they melted away like ice? We need a framework of truth telling so that the country can heal from the effects, from the ravages of bad governance as we usher in a new epoch of leadership that appreciates the values of our people, that appreciates the values of human rights, the values of association and disagreement. So it's our belief that this is lacking. That's why disagreements make people get gray hair, because there's no framework for resolving them. If you disagree, you take the fastest flight when the regime changes. We cannot build a nation that kind of arrangement. 6, buttress mechanisms that guarantee continuity of peace, stability, progress, and prosperity for all Ugandans. We all know how power has been abused in this country. Now, at this stage in our country, who is the guarantor of our national security? Because the national security system has been abused by an individual. Who is the guarantor of our elections? Because all elections have been tinkered with. As people gear up to go and participate in the next election, who is the guarantor of a free and fair electoral process without turning the election into a ritual of sorts? We hesitate as DA to encourage citizens to simply go into a ritual and simply look on at their tear gassed away, and then they wait for a declaration and then say new day, normal stuff. It's not a normal situation. We believe that we must have guarantees because the current security framework cannot guarantee national security. it is repressive, it is partisan. We need a conversation into the guarantees of our security, the guarantees of our electoral outcomes, and how this can be done. I can understand these are really mundane issues. They are alien concepts because we are used to being ruled over like animals. We are saying, we are human, and therefore there must be full participation and understanding of why we participate in politics. Otherwise, we can agree to become a basket case. Okay? In the DA, we are saying we cannot be part of the basket process. We need a very clear process that can guarantee that the outcome of an electoral process is going to be consequential, positively, to the lives of our common peoples. So essentially, those are the 6 objectives for which we clamor for reforms and a transitional framework. I have heard people say that you're talking about very nice things, but General Museveni won't accept. Who tells you that we are here to massage General Museveni? We must compel General Museveni and his people to listen to the people. We must be compelled to listen. Whoever thinks that our job is to take some massage oil to him, no. We are saying all must demand for these. The media, civil society, culture, religious institutions, senior citizens must demand that General Museveni listens. This is not his father's estate. It's a bequest to all of us. And therefore we have a stake in how this bequest is being managed. And therefore a demand using multiple voices is legitimate. That's what we are here for. Demand these stakeholders.
New way, new day.
That these demands are legitimate. We're not trying to impose our views on anybody. We are simply saying this can't continue as normal. Now, comrades, we have set ourselves as the DA a framework we want to share with stakeholders, the form of agenda, an agenda of sorts, because we believe, and honestly believe so, that all these objectives may not be achieved in a single goal. They are multiple, and some of them are multi-stage. They have a multiple stakeholding arrangement. Some of them will have to require the high and the mighty to climb down their high horses to listen. And they may require pep talk. Some of them are simply scared out of their skins. And therefore we need a cascaded framework, a form of agenda from one issue to another that will compel them to say, hey, I think we are being considered. The idea of politicians backing at each other must stop and agree on a framework that can sustain this nation. I have had politicians vowing to crush each other. Don't want to crush each other. Please go at State Square, we shall watch you crush each other. But we have the nation to save. Okay? If you want to go for to box, you can box. But for our country, we are making very clear demands. So in our agenda, cascaded, the first one is to go for key constitutional, electoral, and administrative reforms. I have spoken about that. And you're aware that already I have put before Parliament 8 bills for which we are going to demand for space before Parliament. That is our first on the agenda because the elections are on the horizon. And therefore, there's no amount of waiting that we can do. The Electoral Commission, in its cluster shape, has outed a roadmap. And that roadmap must feed also into the agenda of reforms. I have explained before the nature of the electoral reforms and the constitutional alignments that we desire. Probably I'll speak about them a little bit later, in brief. The second item on the agenda is a national reconciliation and reparation program. The third is adoption of a consensus devolution model. I've talked about reconciliation and the reparation. But the issue of adoption of a consensus devolution model is a power sharing model across the country to replace what we know as decentralization that has failed us. you come from communities where decentralization actually is a dead animal. It's a fossil, dead and buried, you know. So then, if you want to enhance the sharing of national resources and the delivery of the services, what do? We are proposing a devolution framework, call it a federal framework, where power across regions is going to be shared, and we congest the corrupt center and take resources to the people where need lies. This conversation has been around us over time, and then we run away from it because we fear to annoy the center. We are not into an appeasement arrangement. We are into serious business. These planted resources do not belong to an individual. They don't belong to a family or a community. They belong to all of us. Therefore, we want to evolve a framework that can guarantee that every citizen at any one time will have a chance to have a share into the national resources. You can disagree with us and give us an alternative. Now that we all agree that decentralization is a fossil, then, so if you have a different framework, that's why we want this conversation in the public space, so that options are evolved and shared, that we can agree on what works. 4 is adoption of a consensus on proportional representation. I have a proviso in the amendments I provided for Parliament that talks about introducing proportional representation. I may not have enough time to open up the whole idea of how it works, but where it works, the same number of people are represented by the same number of MPs, councillors, etc. You are aware that in Parliament, we have members of Parliament that came to Parliament with 4,000 votes, and their constituency has 6,000 voters, and that is a constituency. In my constituency, Nyendo, as a parish alone, has over 60,000 voters. Just a parish. I am aware in Nansana, for example, a single parish could have about 100,000 people. My brother, the Honorable Segona, represents 500,000 people. I mean, what kind of framework of representation is that? So we need a serious conversation. And that's why, for example, you have had contradictions on the implementation of the parish model. So a parish, there are parishes that have 1,000 people, juxtaposed against Nyendo with 100,000 people. So how do you give those parishes the same amount of money? That is fraud. So we want to overcome fraud in the sharing of national resources. And part of that is to review the framework of representation at all political levels. I don't think it's rocket science. If there are challenges in its implementation, can we begin with particular levels and then increasingly cascade, increasingly review until we have a final model? We can do hybrid. We can start with a particular level and say, for constituencies, we shall use proportional representation. Probably for affirmative action, we will do that. So there must be a starting point. There's no need for denial of the existence of the skilled nature of representation. That's the nature of our conversation that we want to see. Of course, I've talked about the Agenda 5 to organize a free, fair, and consequential election. That is a must. The nature of conversation is what we shall expound what we need our politics. Then 6, peaceful and smooth transfer of power from the NRM to the next government. Surely, it's not true that the next government is the NRM government. If it's the case, then there's no need for us to talk about the election in this country. The next government could be in any party. That's what a democracy is about. So for you to say that the next government is the NRM is to say that we are all stupid. And therefore, we participate in these activities as a ritual. So the conversation as to any government is capable of coming, any party well structured, well organized, in a free and fair process can take over the reins of power is what we want to be a part of as the DA. And in the transition arrangement, because part of the problem, actually the biggest problem, is fear of the transition, fear of change, fear of transition. We want to share with our colleagues that in the national conversation we talked about, there should be an agenda to enact a transitional act. Remember, Comrade Dr. Mpuuga in the 9th Parliament attempted to present the Presidential Transitional Act, a bill for a Presidential Transitional Act. He did not even get leave of Parliament. Because the whole idea of change sends cords down people's spines. We want to help people understand that change will happen. They start self-education that change will happen. And it may happen without them causing it, those who fear it. It's not true that when you fear something, it does not happen. Actually, it's very likely that what you fear will happen. So can we prepare you for the consequences of what you fear? The best form of preparation is enacting legislation that guarantees that change will happen. It will not happen at your behest. It will happen because citizens demand for it and desire it. And therefore, there must be a legal regime that midwives that transition. That's our business as political leaders in this country. So we would like to see a National Transition Act or a Presidential Transition Act. We want to see a National Reconciliation Act. We want to see a Presidential Privileges and Immunities Act reviewed, because there's a fear there. Being the president of Uganda for 40 years, and given the nature of acts of the presidency for 40 years, there's evident fear of transition. Can we, as a people, have a conversation on the nature of safety nets, privileges that can obtain, immunity that can obtain to the presidency, and immediate actors around the presidency? That probably will give some people an opportunity to rethink their insistence on turning this country into a pariah state. We want a National Devolution Act. I talked about devolution and the death of decentralization. These are very eminent provisions we want to see in the kind of amendments we want to see coming. So essentially, the reform process will include constitutional, electoral, and administrative reforms. I talked about the constitutional reforms hitherto in our earlier briefings here and at Parliament, that the key constitutional reforms we want to see include the restoration of term limits. Very key. I have heard comrades say that please, term limits should also come with the age limit. Perfect. Can we have a conversation on how those two feed into each other? Do we need both? Do we need one? Probably some of you are young people, and nobody can blame you. But those of you who are around during the conversation in the C8 times, I was an HSC student. At the initiation of the Constitution, I was in the university first year. But I remember so well the conversation around the age limit and who it was targeting that time. My senior colleagues here know that the age limit at that time, the Constitution was targeting an individual. Yes. So are we as a people going to go for legislative retribution and revenge? Or we can go for a higher, a bigger issue, which is term limit. When you go term limit, in our view, you control both the young and the old. But a conversation as to the retention or the return of age limit is important. Let's have it and then see whether we need both or one of them. So mere dismissing either or, for me, is an act of cowardice. If you want to change this country, leaders, political leaders and actors and pretenders must at least have the courage to speak about very controversial issues, including the ones I've mentioned. But simply running out from them and saying, no, that's not possible. No, for us, we're just ready for an election. Which election? So we would like to invite serious political leaders to rise to the occasion run away from their cowardice and speak about these issues with courage. That these are the issues that we need to seriously act upon in these times. I talked about the critical amendments in the executive, dropping a vice president to go for deputy president. I talked about those issues here too. I don't want to bore you with that conversation. I talked about the downsizing of parliament from the current bloated 550, 59 or thereabout, to reduce the size of parliament by a third. Can we have that conversation? Is there any sane citizen who can say that parliament can even be enlarged? In the current framework, actually, we are destined to expand the size of parliament by an extra 50 MPs. I want to inform the country that there is an ongoing process to enlarge parliament with an additional 50 members of parliament.
Sure.
For me, that's a crime against citizens. So can we have a national conversation as to how this parliament can be downsized? When we discuss devolution, we cannot be discussing devolution and expansion in the same statement. Okay? We agree, if we want to devolve, then we must have some MPs can become councillors in their areas and influence local issues. I'm not trying to really downplay their quality. No, you're not any less of quality because you're a councillor, you're a leader of your people. Some MPs can become governors of their communities. Who knows that his guarantee is going to be in the next parliament? So I'm speaking generally about myself and everyone else. That is the kind we need from our leaders. Not simply, appetite to participate in elections regardless of their consequences. Time has come when we, without contradiction, speak about the possibilities and the impossibilities. So I am now telling you that if nothing is done, the next parliament will be 600 and more. Remember, the structure of our economy is increasingly becoming narrow and narrow. So we have increasingly more mouths to feed and a lot more appetite than the resources at our disposal. So must we expand, political offices, or we need to really expand the framework for such provision in the country. So I have mentioned the acts put before Parliament, including the Presidential Elections Act for Amendment, the Parliamentary Elections Act for Amendment, Local Government Act for Amendment, the political parties, and the other Elections Act for Amendment. Critically, what we are targeting as the DA in the Political Parties Act, the way it was framed, it was actually enacted in bad faith. Political parties, for example, are almost incapable of forming a registered coalition. I have heard comrades in the other political platforms talk about their willingness to work with the others. You cannot register that kind of arrangement. So what was the spirit of enacting that law? We are saying that law is due for amendment to make it possible for platforms to work together in a registrable legal framework. That's our intention. That we do not have scattered multiple, groupings that are inconsequential and incapable of changing our electoral and political platform. I think I talked about the other electoral, the laws. I talked about amending the Electoral Commission Act with a view to doing two things. One, to allow for the voting of the diaspora citizens. There are over 2 million people voting. So the EC can use our missions and the embassies as polling stations for both registration and voting. Two, the voting of prisoners. Yes, prisoners. It's not that you lose every right when you're a prisoner. And we have, we are saying that the only prisoners that cannot vote are those on the death row. Because the presumption of law is that when you're on the death row, you are literally decommissioned as a living person. So the rest must have their rights respected. Luckily, that subject has been litigated upon, And in 2021, court hammered down a decision to say that the Electoral Commission not making provision for the voting of diaspora and prisoners is a violation of their constitutional right. Therefore, it's not really requiring all of us to go to the moon. Have the EC Act amended and make provision for the voting. Prisoners can be registered in their prisons where they are domiciled, and the diaspora at the embassies and missions where they live. So we thought these are issues we need to clarify. Then, of course, I talked about administrative reforms. This is referred to amending and administering reforms to key state agencies and arms of government. The judiciary is due for reform. On another day, probably I can share with you the fear I have on how the judiciary should be reformed, including an environment where judicial officers can be voted by the people. If you want to be a magistrate in Masaka, people in Masaka should vote on you to be their magistrate. They should be able to see a sense of fairness and understanding in you to be their magistrate. They should not be imposed by the government in power everywhere. The government in power the president can appoint Supreme Court judges, probably judges of the Court of Appeal. Our view is that time has come to have a conversation on how other judicial officers beyond the apparent courts can be voted by the people. These are very broad ideas that need a complex conversation we have from stakeholders. We believe that the educational reforms are long overdue. Reforms in health are long overdue. Why don't we have national health insurance? For example, small nations have insurance. Why can't citizens be treated by the state? Citizens that have terminal illnesses, cancers, heart patients, be treated by the state. These need reforms. So if the NRM thinks that we are a growing economy, why are we growing in the numbers and not growing in the service? So we need a conversation. So these are not really very far issues from us. We need reforms in agriculture, in energy, in mineral resources. For example, we all know how mineral resources are being siphoned from this country and benefiting a few. Some of you in the media space have reported on people siphoning gold, siphoning rare earth, siphoning, all sorts of minerals. You know better than me probably. Who is speaking about this? In Parliament, you remember me demanding for the payment of taxes on gold and how I was suffocated on this debate. And members of Parliament did not care about this matter. They thought it's a small matter. Those are your MPs. So we need a conversation on these resources and how they benefit the nation. At the DA, we are not cowards. We want this conversation on the floor.